Very much indeed for that introduction, and indeed thank you very much for inviting me here to talk to you today about the unusual and unique organisation which is the Crown Estate. As Chief Executive of the Crown Estate, it's my job to try and deliver sustainable long-term growth of our portfolio, whatever the market conditions, be they benign and stable or difficult and turbulent. So, where does that leave us today? Well, last year the Crown Estate celebrated its 250th anniversary, so it's probably not unreasonable to describe us as a long-term business. Obviously, I very much hope that we'll still be around in 250 years' time, but I won't be around to see it. It's also probably not unreasonable to describe these as turbulent times. We've been through the worst recession since the 1930s, and economic and market conditions continue to be challenging and are likely to remain so for some time to come. I'll say a bit more about current market conditions in a moment, but the main focus of what I have to say this morning is about the unusual characteristics and qualities of the Crown Estate as a long-term business, which both help and hinder us in the current environment, how we try to exploit the inbuilt advantages that we have and to mitigate some of the constraints within which we have to operate, and how we try to balance the imperatives of delivering year-on-year performance while protecting and promoting the long-term nature of our business. But a few words first on the economy and property market. Suffice it to say that in terms of GDP, in 2008-9, we suffered the longest and deepest recession since before the war, and the recovery during 2010 has been modest at best. Indeed, the GDP figures for the last quarter of last year, which showed a reduction of minus 0.6, were something of a rude shock, even if we were suffering from the wrong kind of snow. And the graph you see up on the screen shows you in the right-hand end that very deep reduction in GDP in 2008-09, and indeed it just shows the last quarter of 2010 where growth has tailed off again. But going back to the start of all this, the property market was one of the first sectors into recession, experiencing steep falls in capital values in the second half of 2007-08, and again you can see that towards the right-hand side of this graph. And by the end of that period, values were down by more than 40%. Indeed, the total return from property in 2008 was minus 22%. The picture continued to deteriorate during 2009, but by the end of that year, capital growth had begun to go positive again, and it climbed quite sharply in early 2010. Total returns also came back quite sharply in the first half of 2010, and revenue growth began to recover, particularly in central London. But towards the end of last year, capital and revenue growth both began to slow again and now seem to have plateaued. As we come into 2011, the economic prospects inevitably look uncertain, with a number of indicators not looking too helpful. Inflation remains stubbornly high, and interest rates seem likely to rise before too long. Consumer demand is muted, and is likely to remain so as disposable incomes are squeezed over the coming months. And substantial planned cuts in public expenditure are in prospect, as is a significant loss of public sector jobs. Of course, the government is having to take some extremely difficult decisions, and we all hope their economic strategy to reduce the deficit will work and ultimately lay the foundations for sustainable economic growth. And indeed, some of the economic indicators, such as manufacturing and construction, are now beginning to look quite positive. But there is inevitably at this stage some uncertainty about how far and how fast overall economic recovery will happen. There still appears to be consensus, however, that we will avoid the much-feared double-dip recession, but that economic recovery is likely to be sluggish, at least for the coming year. The consensus view on the prospects for the property market is rather more difficult to discern, but it's probably not hugely different from that for the economy as a whole. For the most part, reasonably stable, but probably unspectacular. So we're not quite out of the woods just yet. So, where does all that leave the Crown Estate? Well, first of all, I think I'd better say a few words about this unusual business, who we are, what exactly we do, and how we go about it. Under the Crown Estate Act, and we are a creature of Parliament, our role is to manage and turn to account the hereditary land and properties of the monarch. They're not a personal property, but they're owned by the sovereign, as the phrase has it, in right of the Crown. The Crown Estate as an institution is constituted as a trust with a board of commissioners who have all the powers of an owner. All the profits of the Crown Estate go to the Treasury for the benefit of the public finances. And this arrangement dates back to 1760, when George III, who at the time was in need of a regular and predictable income, entered into an agreement with the government of the day that he would retain the title of his properties, but the government would assume responsibility for their management and retain any profit. In return, the monarch received the civil list. And that arrangement has been renewed by every subsequent monarch and is still the arrangement that applies today. The proposed new sovereign support grant announced last year by the Chancellor, about which you may have heard, has not changed the fundamentals of this arrangement, despite what you may have read in some of the more excitable sections of the press. As to the estate itself, well, it consists of 4 major portfolios with a combined capital value in excess of £6 billion and gross revenue in 2009-10 of £300 million. The commercial urban portfolio accounts for some 3/4 of both the Crown Estate's total capital value and its total revenue. It's concentrated in central London, particularly the West End, where we own the whole of Regent Street and much of St James's. But it also includes an increasingly significant element outside central London, which mostly comprises retail parks and shopping centres in prominent regional locations, as well as some offices and business parks. It also includes high-value heritage residential properties, for example, those around the perimeter of Regent's Park, Carlton House Terrace, just beside the Mall, and Kensington Palace Gardens, just adjacent to Kensington Palace itself. The rural estate, some 300,000 acres of farmland and forestry right across the UK, and I'm afraid I'm too old to do hectares. The rural estate accounts for just 15% of our total capital value and provides about 7% of our revenue. It consists of over 40 individual agricultural estates across the UK, from Glenlivet in the Scottish Highlands down to Dunster on the edge of Exmoor, and it comprises some 750 tenanted farms, about 1/3 of which are given over to livestock and 2/3 are arable. The rural estate also includes forestry, some of which we manage in hand, so some of our employees are foresters, and some of which we let to the Forestry Commission, which has been in the news recently. It also includes minerals, including quarries for slate, granite, and Portland stone, and a variety of ancillary residential and commercial property. The marine estate encompasses around half the UK's foreshore and almost all of the seabed out to the 12 nautical mile territorial limit right around the UK. It also includes the right to explore and utilise the natural resources, apart from hydrocarbons, of the UK continental shelf. At present, the marine estate accounts for about 7% of our capital value and just over 16% of our revenue. It's home to a huge variety of businesses and activities, ranging from marinas, cables and pipelines, fish farms, of which there are more than 900 around the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, and moorings, of which there are literally thousands right around the coast. If there are any yachtsmen here today, you may well have come across us. To sand and gravel extraction from the seabed for construction industry, and offshore renewable energy, which promises to become the big game in town, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a moment. Finally, the Crown Estate is responsible for the management of Windsor Great Park, what might be described